They didn't scream at first, not the wife when she drank the poison, not the night when they chained him, not the bishop when he passed sentence. In Würzburg, silence always came before the burning, but this wasn't a witch. It wasn't heresy. It wasn't even war. It was a nobleman, a knight, who killed his own wife, not with a sword but with a goblet. No blood spilled, no blade drawn, just poison, and in the eyes of medieval law that made it worse, far worse. Because to use poison was to reject the knight's code entirely, to murder from the shadows, without honor, without risk. The church called it a coward's weapon, and in Würzburg, cowardice didn't just cost you your title, it cost you your flesh. They said the cauldron hissed before he did, that his skin blistered before the water boiled, that the crowd watched not in horror, but in holy satisfaction. But long before the iron cracked, the story had already begun, with a nobleman's pride, a poisoned woman, and a town ready to turn justice into spectacle. And it all starts here, with the Knight of Würzburg. He wasn't the kind of man you imagined pleading. He was the kind that made others kneel. Born to a long line of Franconian knights, raised in the shadow of Würzburg's cathedral spires, trained not just in war, but in dominion. His name opened doors, his silence closed them, and his wife, she wasn't part of the plan. She was chosen for alliance, not affection. A noble daughter from a lesser house, handed over in a dowry contract disguised as a wedding. She smiled on their wedding day, once. After that, it was as if the castle walls swallowed her. Inside the manor they rarely spoke. He rode, she read, he dined late, she ate alone. But silence, like rot, always spreads. Servants whispered that the knight had taken lovers in town. Others said he beat her behind closed doors. The truth, no one truly knew, because in Würzburg, noble walls didn't echo, they absorbed, and the woman inside those walls. She began to fade, her skin paled, her voice thinned, but her eyes, those stayed sharp, too sharp, as if she knew something no one else dared name. Then came the dinner, just the two of them, no guests, no priests, no witnesses, roast venison, boiled barley, and a single goblet of wine filled by his hand. She drank, minutes passed, her body shivered, her lips twitched, and then she collapsed against the table with a sound softer than breath. He called for help, of course. He wept. He shouted. He held her body like a man broken, but something didn't fit. The knight cried too quickly, and those who heard him swore it didn't sound like grief. It sounded like rehearsal. The apothecary was summoned, the bishop informed. And by nightfall, the rumor had already outrun the truth. The lady had been poisoned, and no one else had poured the wine. And that was when Würzburg remembered. Poison was not just a murder weapon, it was treason in silk. She had no wound, no bruises, just stillness and a faint violet tint to her lips. A woman dead without a struggle, in a castle guarded by knights, with only her husband beside her. In the logic of medieval judgment, that was all the evidence anyone needed. The bishop's men came at dawn, not as guests, not as messengers, but as executioners with patience. And when they dragged the knight from his bed, he didn't fight, he didn't shout, he only asked them to spare his armor. They didn't. Because now it wasn't a question of guilt, it was a matter of cleansing. And boiling water, they said, reached deeper than any sword ever could. The goblet had been poured, the body laid out. The sentence was only waiting for a fire. She was already dying long before the poison touched her lips, not in the way medicine could name, but in the way silence eats away at the edges of a person. In the portraits, she looked serene, head high, jaw soft, hair veiled in the style of noble wives. But behind the doors of her stone prison, she was invisible. He spoke more to his horse than to her. She dined alone, always at the far end of the long table, where candlelight barely reached. No laughter, no music. Only the faint sound of her breathing, shallow and careful, as if afraid to disturb the air itself. She wrote letters, pages of them. No one knows if they were sent or burned. Some say they were to her mother. Others believe she wrote to herself, to remember who she had been before the wedding. There were days she didn't speak a word, not to the maids, not to the cook, not to God. The servants watched her with the reverence one gives the dead, quietly and from a distance. And yet there was no panic, no rebellion. She was waiting, whether for escape or for death no one could say. The night she died, something was different. She wore color, a ribbon of pale blue at her neck. She said she felt well, better than usual. Her voice carried across the hall with a softness no one had heard in weeks. And when she sat beside him at the table, eyes meeting eyes, there was something strange in the way she smiled. Not warm, not bitter, something between surrender and defiance. As if she knew, as if she had chosen to drink it anyway. He poured the wine. She raised the goblet, and for a single moment, time stood still inside the castle. The fire crackled. The wind shifted, and her hand trembled just slightly before she drank. Some say she whispered something to him. Others say he whispered to her, but whatever was spoken, it didn't stop what came next. Her body turned cold before it hit the floor. He caught her, but didn't hold on. He called for help, but not too loudly. And when the servants arrived, the first thing they saw wasn't her. It was the untouched second goblet he had poured for himself, still full, still clean. The bishop's men arrived with unnatural speed, as if they had been waiting for her to die, as if someone had told them the wine would not stay warm for long. And as her body was wrapped in the church's linen and the goblet was sealed in a box, the question shifted from who did it to how should he pay for it? Because in Würzburg, murder was forgivable, but poison was something else entirely. Würzburg never needed a trial to know a man was guilty. It only needed a rumor to match what it already believed. And this time, the rumor came with a body, a goblet, and a nobleman too calm for grief. The town began to speak before the church did. The baker swore he saw the night smirking the morning after. The laundress claimed the lady had once confided in her about strange tastes in her food. None of it was proven. None of it mattered, because in the medieval mind, poison was not just a method, it was a philosophy. It meant you struck in secret, you feared justice, you betrayed your own blood without the courage to face it. The bishop's men took control swiftly. The estate was sealed, the wine cellars searched, his chamber servants questioned, and the knight himself, he said nothing, not in protest, not in denial. He watched it unfold with the same coldness he showed his wife at dinner. The silence that once protected him now rotted into guilt, because in this world, a sword could be forgiven, but poison was a coward's crown. And cowardice, when worn by a noble, became contagion. The church feared that more than murder, if left unpunished, it would spread. So the punishment had to be louder than the crime, There was no formal inquest. The bishop called a closed council. Only clergy attended. No jury, no scribes, no mercy. And when the sentence was delivered, it was not written. It was spoken loudly from the pulpit. Let the one who spilled venom burn in boiling water, that his cowardice may scream out of him like steam. It wasn't doctrine, it wasn't even law, it was theater disguised as righteousness. The night was seized before dawn. They didn't come with swords, they came with hooks, iron cuffs, and a wagon lined with hay. His armor was stripped in the courtyard. His ring pulled from his finger, and when the chains were fastened, he finally spoke, not to deny, not to confess, but to ask if he could pray. They told him he already had his chance. Word of the sentence spread faster than the fever that haunted the lower wards. By midday, the townspeople were gathering in front of the cathedral, not to mourn, not to protest, to watch, because this would not be a hanging. This would not be a beheading. This would be the kind of justice you don't forget even when you close your eyes. And behind the cathedral doors, the cauldron was being filled. They built the cauldron like it was part of the altar. Iron forged, waist-high, blackened from prior burnings, though none as grand as this. It sat beneath the cathedral steps like a relic of some older, crueler god. And as the bishop ascended to lead morning prayer, the fire beneath it had already been lit. The execution was not a formality, it was a sermon, wood soaked in fat, smoke laced with incense, water darkened not with ash, but with oil. The kind that clung to the skin, the kind that screamed before the man did. The knight was led forward, barefoot, stripped of his tunic, shackled at the wrists and ankles. Not once did he beg, he didn't plead innocence. He looked straight ahead until he saw the cauldron, and then, for the first time, his legs gave. Not all men fear death, but all men fear dying like this. He asked to speak to a priest. They said the bishop would watch. That was enough. Crowds pressed against the cathedral walls, shoulder to shoulder, hushed not by reverence, but anticipation. Children lifted by fathers, mothers hiding their eyes behind veils, but still peeking through the fabric, merchants pausing their scales, nobles watching from balconies as if attending a parade. The town didn't come for justice, it came to witness a man become nothing. They tied him to the pulley rig above the vat. Slowly, deliberately, the chains groaned louder than the crowd. The bishop raised his hand, then lowered it, and the platform dropped, just enough for his feet to touch the surface. The knight howled, not like a warrior, but like a man who had never screamed before. The steam swallowed his face. Blisters rose faster than the oil could bubble. The skin on his legs peeled in strips, sliding into the cauldron like ribbons of pork. But they didn't lower him all at once. That would be mercy. Instead, the executioners cranked the winch, inch by inch, pausing with each pull so the nerves would not die too quickly. The crowd did not turn away. Some flinched, some wept, but no one left, because this wasn't just punishment. It was ritual. A noble had broken the sacred bond of blood and marriage, and the church had answered not with scripture, but with fire. The bishop did not pray, he simply watched, like the crowd, like God. And above the rising mist, the knight's screams began to change, not louder, not softer, just less human. Pain changes its voice. At first, he screamed like a man drowning in fire, loud, raw, desperate. But as the boiling reached his thighs, the sound broke. It cracked, it whimpered. Then it stopped sounding human altogether. The steam didn't rise. It exploded. The smell hit before the sound did. Hair burned, flesh split, oil popping like firewood. The crowd staggered back, not from guilt, but from the stench. And yet they stayed, because no one wanted to look away when justice boiled. They cranked him lower, inch by inch, until his arms shook not from pain, but from the nervous system collapsing. Skin floated in clumps. His chest turned purple, then gray, then black. His mouth opened, but the sound no longer came. The nerves had frayed, the vocal cords gone. Only the eyes moved. They darted left, then up, then locked on something no one else could see. Some claimed he saw angels. Others said he saw her, his wife, waiting on the other side, whole and calm, untouched by fire. Or maybe he just saw the crowd and realized he had become entertainment. The bishop didn't speak. He didn't need to. This wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about example. The kind of punishment that made others shiver when they held a goblet. Because the church understood something deeper than doctrine, fear lasts longer than memory. When they finally let him drop fully, it wasn't a man that fell in. It was a husk, half-cooked, mottled, limp. The water hissed, then settled. He didn't float. He sank, slowly, like a lie swallowed by the mouth that told it. There was no cheer. No applause, only breathing, heavy, real, ashamed. The crowd began to disperse, shoes scraping on stone, children silent now. A few vomited. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered prayers not for the dead knight, but for themselves. Because watching a man boil does not cleanse you, it stains. And the stain, they would learn, doesn't wash off with holy water. In the end, all that remained above the rim of the iron pot was silence. The silence after a man boils is never clean. It hangs, not just in the air, but in the lungs of everyone who watched. People left the cathedral square like mourners who couldn't decide if they'd witnessed justice or something older, darker, unspoken. No one looked each other in the eye. Some walked straight home and didn't come out for days. Others drank themselves numb by sundown, but none of them forgot. In the following week, the fountains of Würzburg ran clear, but no one trusted the water. Apothecaries shuttered their stalls. No one touched wine unless it had been poured by their own hand. Servants were questioned. Wives stared too long at their husbands, and every goblet in every noble house became a symbol, not of status, but of risk. The knight's name was erased faster than his screams faded. The bishop gave no funeral mass, no marker, no public statement. It was as if he had never existed. Only the cauldron remained, blackened and silent, wheeled back behind the cathedral like a relic of God's most vengeful hour. They didn't clean it. They didn't touch it. Even the executioners refused to look at it twice. And still, no one mentioned the wife. Her body had been buried in consecrated ground, quietly, without procession. No one sang. No one wept publicly, and yet candles appeared by her grave, small ones, melted stubs, left without names, without prayers, as if the town needed her forgiveness, even if it never admitted what had been done. Maybe it wasn't justice. Maybe it was fear that demanded a boiling, and fear, once unleashed, doesn't just punish the guilty, it haunts the witnesses. Children who had watched the night burn began waking in the night, screaming. Some said they saw steam rising from their chamber pots. Others whispered that the cauldron still bubbled at midnight, even without fire. Superstition spread like smoke. It wasn't the execution they feared, it was the aftermath. Because when a town watches a man become ash and oil, it doesn't just purge evil, it learns what it's capable of. And long after the priest's robes had been folded, long after the crowd had moved on, Würzburg was no longer just a town with a bishop and a knight. It was a place where justice had boiled, slow, loud, unforgettable, and what remained refused to sink. The cauldron was never used again, not for criminals, not for traitors, not even for witches. It was too much, too specific. It had done something the rope and axe never could. It made everyone feel responsible. And when fear turns to shame, silence follows. For decades, the story lived only in whispers: the knight who boiled, the wife who drank, the church that watched. No one carved his name into stone. No one honored hers either. Their lives vanished into smoke and oil, but the heat of that day stayed. In kitchens, in pews, in the nerves of children who became parents, who warned their sons, never trust a man who pours your drink without drinking first. Historians would later doubt the event ever happened. Too brutal, they said, too theatrical, and yet the records in the Würzburg diocese speak of a nobleman cleansed in the basin of God's wrath. No name, no date. Just that line, written in the same ink used to bless marriages and bury saints. Perhaps that was the worst part, not the death, not the pain, but the way it was all folded into ritual, sanctioned, sealed, erased. The bishop went on to live a long life. The town grew wealthier. The church rebuilt a new wing of the cathedral, and still, no one could look at boiling water without thinking of flesh. For centuries, Würzburg avoided the word, not poison, not night, not even murder, just the cauldron. And every time someone said it, the room went quiet. They said the knight of Würzburg boiled for his sins, but no one ever said what sin came first, poison or silence. And long after his flesh melted, the town kept boiling in its own quiet fear. Because justice doesn't always end when the screaming stops. Sometimes it begins when no one screams at all. But he wasn't the only one the fire touched. Joan of Arc burned not for poison, but for purity. She fought for her king, and they lit the flames anyway. The crowd watched, the church watched, and Gilles de Rais, he watched her die, then vanished into a darkness far worse than fire. What he did next still echoes in nightmares. If you think boiling a man alive was the edge of medieval horror, you haven't seen what happened to a saint or what rose from her ashes. Watch Joan of Arc. Watch Gilles de Rais. A new story waits. See you in the next video, right here on the channel.